July 11, 1943, the steppe south of Prokhorovka. The wheat fields of the Kursk salient stretched endlessly under the summer sun, golden and peaceful. But beneath this pastoral calm, the earth trembled with the approach of steel titans. Tank commander Vasily Bryukov stood in the turret of his T-34, watching the horizon shimmer in the afternoon heat. He was 23 years old and had been fighting the Germans for 2 years. He had learned that the peaceful moments before battle were often the most terrifying. Comrade Lieutenant, his gunner Mikhail, called up from below. The radio man says the Germans are massing to the south. Tigers and panthers, hundreds of them. Vasily nodded slowly. They all knew what was coming. The greatest tank battle in human history was about to unfold on these very fields, and most of them would not survive to tell the tale. To understand Prokhorovka, one must first understand Kursk. In the spring of 1943, the Eastern Front had reached a pivotal moment. After the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, Adolf Hitler desperately needed a victory to restore German prestige and stabilize the front. The Kursk salient, a massive bulge in the Soviet lines extending nearly 120 miles into German-held territory, presented what appeared to be a perfect opportunity. Operation Citadel, as the Germans called it, would be the largest offensive operation they would launch in 1943. The plan was elegantly simple. A massive pincer movement would slice through the northern and southern shoulders of the salient, trapping and destroying the Soviet forces within. It would be a repeat of the great encirclements of 1941, when entire Soviet armies had been swallowed whole. But this time, the Soviets knew what was coming. Through a combination of espionage, aerial reconnaissance, and the interrogation of captured German soldiers, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and the Soviet High Command had detailed knowledge of German plans. They would not be caught off guard. Instead, they would turn the Kursk salient into a killing ground, a defense in depth so formidable that the German offensive would shatter against it like waves against granite cliffs. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, assembled the most powerful striking force the Wehrmacht had ever concentrated in one sector. The WWII SS Panzer Corps, under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, formed the spearhead. This elite formation consisted of 3 Waffen-SS divisions: Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, each one a formidable fighting unit with fearsome reputations earned in blood across the steppes of Russia. The Germans brought their newest weapons to Kursk. The Panzer VI Tiger Fern, with its 88mm gun and nearly impenetrable frontal armor, could destroy Soviet tanks from ranges where return fire was impossible. The new Panther tank, despite its teething problems, represented a quantum leap in armored warfare technology. Dozens of the massive Ferdinand tank destroyers, each mounting a long-barreled 88mm gun in a heavily armored casemate, lumbered into position. By early July 1943, von Manstein had concentrated nearly 2,500 tanks and assault guns in his sector alone. The air above them would be filled with Stukas, Focke-Wulfs, and Messerschmitts. This was the sword that would cut through the Soviet defenses, but the Soviets had prepared their shield. The defense of the Kursk salient represented Soviet military planning at its finest. Under Zhukov's direction, the Red Army constructed 8 defensive belts extending to a depth of nearly 100 miles. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers dug trenches, laid minefields, positioned anti-tank guns, and fortified villages. They transformed the entire salient into an interconnected fortress. Behind these defensive lines, the Soviets assembled their own armored fist. The 5th Guards Tank Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, represented the Soviet Strategic Reserve. Consisting of nearly 850 tanks and self-propelled guns, this force would be the hammer that would strike the German anvil when the moment came. Rotmistrov was a veteran of the desperate battles of 1941 and 1942. He had watched German tanks encircle and destroy entire Soviet armies. He had learned bitter lessons about German tactical superiority. But now, in the summer of 1943, the balance was shifting. Soviet tank crews were better trained. Their tactics had evolved, and most importantly, their industrial base was producing tanks in quantities that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The stage was set for the collision at Prokhorovka. The German assault commenced on July 5th with an artillery barrage that turned the morning sky orange with fire. Von Manstein's forces struck northward, aiming to break through Soviet defenses and link up with Army Group Center attacking from the north. For 6 days, the battle raged with apocalyptic fury. Villages changed hands multiple times. Fields became graveyards of burning steel. Soviet defenders fought with desperate courage, falling back from one defensive line to the next, making the Germans pay in blood for every mile. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler carved through the Soviet 52nd Guards Rifle Division, but at terrible cost. Soviet anti-tank guns dug into concealed positions, knocked out dozens of German tanks. The 73rd Guards Rifle Division fought to complete destruction at the Pisel River, buying time with their lives for reinforcements to arrive. In the skies above, the largest air battle in history unfolded. Hundreds of aircraft fought swirling dogfights with burning planes falling like meteors into the wheat fields below. The Luftwaffe initially dominated, but Soviet pilots threw themselves into the battle with reckless courage. Trading losses for time, Captain Hermann Buchner, commanding a Tiger tank in the Das Reich Division, watched in awe and horror as the battle unfolded. "We advanced through hell itself," he would later write. The ground shook with explosions. The air was thick with smoke and dust. T-34s charged at us from concealed positions, trying to get close enough for their guns to penetrate our armor. We destroyed them by the dozens, but still they came. By July 11th, von Manstein's forces had penetrated nearly 20 miles into the Soviet defensive system, but they had not achieved the breakthrough that Operation Citadel required. The Soviet defense had bent but not broken. German losses in tanks and men were mounting to unsustainable levels. The offensive was losing momentum, and then Soviet intelligence reported something that changed everything. Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army was racing toward the battlefield, preparing to launch a massive counteroffensive. The collision point would be the fields around the small railway station of Prokhorovka. Vasily Brukhov's T-34 was part of the 29th Tank Corps, one of the formations under Rotmistrov's command. For 3 days they had been racing across the steppe toward Prokhorovka. The forced march had been brutal. Tanks broke down and were left behind. Crews fought exhaustion, sustained by adrenaline and the knowledge that their comrades were dying while they raced to their aid. Inside his tank, the air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, gun oil, and unwashed bodies. The crew had been living in their steel coffin for days, sleeping in brief snatches, eating whatever rations they could stuff into their mouths while the T-34 rumbled forward. "How much farther, Lieutenant?" Mikhail asked, his voice hoarse. "We'll reach the assembly area by dawn," Vasily replied. "Then we attack." His driver, a taciturn Ukrainian named Petro, spoke up for the first time in hours. "My cousin fought the Tigers at Kursk. His whole company was destroyed. 11 tanks knocked out in 15 minutes. The Tigers stood off at distance and picked them apart." The tank fell silent. They all knew the statistics. A Tiger's 88mm gun could penetrate a T-34's armor from over a mile away. The T-34's 76mm gun could only hope to penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at point-blank range, and even then, only if they hit a weak spot. "That's why we won't fight them at distance," Vasily said. "We'll charge them, get so close they can't bring their guns to bear before we're on top of them. It's the only way." It was a suicide tactic, and everyone in the tank knew it, but it was also the only chance they had. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a Tiger the Furs in the Leibstandarte Division, was one of the most successful tank commanders in the Wehrmacht. He had destroyed dozens of enemy tanks, and his crew had developed an almost telepathic coordination. His Tiger, number 1331, was a feared sight on the battlefield. On the night of July 11th, Wittmann and his crew performed maintenance on their Tiger in the gathering darkness. They knew a major Soviet counterattack was coming. Reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the massive columns of Soviet tanks moving toward Prokhorovka. "Let them come," Wittmann's gunner, Balthazar Wall, said confidently. "We'll stack their burning hulks like cordwood." Wittmann was less confident. "There are a lot of them," he said quietly. "More than we've ever faced at once. The Ivans are learning. They're not as easy to kill as they were in 41. The German forces around Prokhorovka included approximately 300-400 tanks and assault guns, including about 100 Tigers and Panthers. Against them, Rotmistrov was bringing over 600 tanks, the T-34s and smaller numbers of T-70 light tanks and heavy KV-1s. The Germans had quality and training on their side. The Soviets had quantity and determination. Tomorrow would reveal which advantage was more important. A thick morning fog blanketed the fields around Prokhorovka as dawn broke on July 12th. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. This weather was a gift from the gods for the Soviet forces. It would negate the German advantage in long-range gunnery. Vasily stood in his turret, straining to see through the gray murk. Around him, hundreds of T-34s idled in their assembly positions, each one a steel beast waiting to be unleashed. The air vibrated with the roar of hundreds of engines. At 8:30 a.m., the order came down from Army headquarters: attack. The Soviet artillery opened fire with a rolling barrage that turned the fog orange and red with explosions. Katyusha rocket launchers added their distinctive shriek to the cacophony. For 30 minutes, Soviet guns pounded the German positions. Then came the order that every tank commander had been dreading and anticipating: forward. For the motherland! 600 Soviet tanks surged forward into the fog, advancing at maximum speed toward the German lines. The greatest tank battle in history had begun. The fog was both blessing and curse. It concealed the Soviet advance, but it also made coordination nearly impossible. Tank formations became disorganized almost immediately. Commanders lost visual contact with their units. The battlefield dissolved into dozens of separate, confused engagements. Vasily's T-34 roared across the wheat fields at nearly 30 miles per hour. His world had narrowed to the small circle of visibility around his tank. Somewhere in the fog ahead were the Germans. The plan was simple: get close enough to negate their range advantage, then overwhelm them with numbers and aggression. Tank. Dead ahead, Mikhail suddenly screamed. A monstrous shape materialized out of the fog. A Tiger WWII, its long 88mm gun swinging toward them. Driver, full speed. Gunner, load high explosive and aim for the tracks. The T-34 accelerated. The Tiger fired. The shell screamed past Vasily's head, missing by inches. Before the Tiger could reload, they were on it. Mikhail fired at point-blank range. The shell struck the Tiger's right track, immobilizing it. Keep moving. Don't stop! Vasily shouted. They roared past the crippled Tiger. Behind them, another T-34 appeared out of the fog and fired into the Tiger's side armor, where it was more vulnerable. The massive German tank exploded, but dozens more T-34s weren't so lucky. German tanks and anti-tank guns were firing blind into the fog, and Soviet tanks were charging straight into their shells. The field became littered with burning Soviet tanks, each one a funeral pyre for its crew. By noon, the fog had begun to lift, revealing a scene of indescribable carnage. The wheat fields around Prokhorovka had been transformed into a nightmare landscape of burning steel, cratered earth, and desperate men fighting for their lives. The battle had dissolved into a massive, swirling melee. Soviet and German tanks fought at ranges measured in yards, not miles. T-34s rammed into Tigers when their guns couldn't penetrate the German armor. Crews from disabled tanks fought each other with submachine guns and grenades. The smoke from burning vehicles was so thick that visibility remained severely limited even after the fog lifted. SS Hauptsturmführer Wittmann found himself in the midst of this chaos, fighting for his life. His Tiger had destroyed 6 Soviet tanks in the first hour of battle, but now he was surrounded. T-34s were attacking from all directions, trying to get close enough to hit his tank's vulnerable side and rear armor. Target left. Target right. Target rear. His gunner was screaming, trying to keep track of the threats. Wittmann's driver was performing miracles, keeping the Tiger moving and preventing the Soviet tanks from getting a clean shot at their vulnerable points. The Tiger's thick armor was stopping most Soviet shells, but several had penetrated the turret mantlet and one had damaged the gun's recoil mechanism. We're losing hydraulic fluid, the gunner reported. The turret traverse is slowing down. This was a death sentence in a close-range tank battle. If they couldn't traverse the turret fast enough to engage threats, they would be killed. All tanks, this is Wittmann. He broadcast on the company radio net. I'm immobilized and need support. Grid reference. An explosion rocked the Tiger. A T-34 had gotten around to their rear and fired at point-blank range. The shell penetrated the engine compartment and flames began to spread. Bail out. Bail out, Wittmann ordered. His crew scrambled out of the hatches as flames engulfed the Tiger. They had destroyed 9 Soviet tanks before being knocked out themselves. Around them, the battle continued to rage. Vasily's T-34 had somehow survived the first 2 hours of the battle. They had destroyed 2 German Panzer IVs and damaged a Tiger, but their luck was running out. "We're down to 4 armor-piercing rounds," Mikhail reported. "After that, it's just high explosive." Vasily scanned the battlefield through his periscope. Everywhere he looked, tanks were burning. Soviet and German machines lay interspersed, some still aflame, others already reduced to smoking hulks. Bodies lay scattered across the ground. The beautiful wheat fields had been churned into a muddy, cratered wasteland. A Panther tank appeared from behind a burning T-34. Its long 75mm gun was already tracking toward them. "Driver, evasive," Vasily shouted. The T-34 swerved hard left. The Panther's shell missed by a hair's breadth. Mikhail fired back, but the armor-piercing round bounced off the Panther's sloped frontal armor. "I can't penetrate it from the front," Mikhail shouted in frustration. "Then we get behind it," Vasily said grimly. "Driver hard right. Flank speed." What followed was a deadly dance. The T-34 used its superior maneuverability to try to get around the Panther's flank, while the Panther tried to keep its frontal armor facing them. Both tanks fired and missed as they circled each other at point-blank range. Then Petro, their driver, performed a maneuver that would save their lives. He drove straight at the Panther, forcing the German tank to back up or be rammed. The Panther's driver panicked, backed directly into a crater. The heavy German tank tilted at a steep angle, temporarily unable to traverse its gun. "Shoot! Shoot now!" Vasily screamed. Mikhail fired at the Panther's exposed side armor. The armor-piercing round punched through, and the Panther exploded from within as its ammunition cooked off. But there was no time to celebrate. Another German tank was approaching, and they were down to 3 armor-piercing rounds. While the massive tank battle raged in the open fields, dozens of smaller but equally desperate fights were taking place across the Prokhorovka sector. One of the most significant was the battle for Hill 252.2, a modest elevation that overlooked the entire battlefield. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich had occupied the hill earlier in the day, and from this vantage point, their tanks and anti-tank guns had devastated Soviet formations attacking across the open ground below. Lieutenant Colonel Vasily Popel, commanding a battalion of the 181st Tank Brigade, received orders to take the hill at any cost. His battalion had started the day with 32 T-34s. By noon, only 17 remained operational. "The hill must be taken," the brigade commander told him over the radio. "The Germans are using it to massacre our forces. You will attack immediately." Popel studied the hill through his binoculars. The slope was covered with disabled and burning Soviet tanks from previous unsuccessful assaults. German tanks were hull down on the crest, presenting only their turrets as targets. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover every avenue of approach. "It's suicide," his deputy commander said quietly. "Yes," Popel agreed. "But those are our orders." He briefed his tank commanders on the plan. They would attack in 2 waves. The first wave would draw German fire and hopefully suppress some of the anti-tank guns. The second wave would exploit any opening created by the first. It was a brutal calculation. Trading lives for a small chance of success. The attack went in at 2 p.m. The first wave of 9 T-34s charged up the slope. German anti-tank guns opened fire immediately. Within minutes, 7 of the 9 tanks were burning wrecks. But the 2 survivors reached the crest and began firing into the German positions at point-blank range. The second wave exploited the chaos, racing up the slope while the Germans were engaged with the first wave. They lost 4 tanks on the approach, but 4 more reached the top. What followed was a desperate close-quarters battle among the German positions. Soviet and German tanks fired at each other from ranges of 10 to 20 yards. Infantry emerged from foxholes to attack tanks with magnetic mines and Molotov cocktails. The hill summit became an inferno of fire and explosions. By 3:00 p.m., the hill had changed hands. Of Popel's 17 tanks, only 3 survived the assault. But the German observation post had been neutralized, and Soviet forces below could maneuver without being destroyed from above. Popel sat in his tank, covered in soot and blood from a wound he didn't remember receiving. The hill had cost them 14 tanks and over 50 men, but the greater battle might be winnable now. 5 miles south of the main engagement, another desperate battle was unfolding at the Oktobersky State Farm, a collective farm that had been fortified by the Germans into a strongpoint. The 11th Guards Tank Brigade had been ordered to capture the farm to prevent German forces from flanking the main Soviet assault. Leading the attack was Senior Lieutenant Ivan Skomorokov, a veteran tanker who had fought at Stalingrad. The State Farm was defended by elements of the Totenkopf division, including several Tiger tanks, infantry with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and dug-in anti-tank guns. The farm buildings provided excellent cover and firing positions. Skomorokov's first attack was repulsed with heavy losses. His second attempt fared no better. By mid-afternoon, he had lost half his brigade. "We're not breaking through frontally," he told his remaining commanders. "We'll try a different approach." He sent a small force to feint another frontal attack while the bulk of his remaining tanks circled around through a ravine to attack the farm from the rear. It was a risky maneuver. If the Germans detected it, his forces would be caught in the open and destroyed. The feint drew German attention and fire. Meanwhile, Skomorokov's main force navigated through the ravine, their tanks churning through muddy ground that threatened to bog them down at any moment. They emerged from the ravine behind the German positions. For a brief moment, they had complete surprise. Soviet tanks poured fire into the rear of German positions, destroying several anti-tank guns and scattering the infantry. But the Tigers reacted quickly, their turrets traversing to meet the new threat. A brutal point-blank engagement erupted. Soviet tanks traded their lives to get shots at the Tigers' vulnerable rear armor. By evening, the Oktobersky State Farm was in Soviet hands, but at terrible cost. Skomorokov's brigade had been effectively destroyed. Of the 42 tanks he had started with, only 8 remained operational. But the German flank had been secured, and their strong point eliminated. At 2:30 p.m., the German Luftwaffe arrived in force over the Prokhorovka battlefield. Stuka's dive bombers screamed down through the smoke to attack Soviet tank formations. Focke-Wulf fighters strafed anything that moved. For a critical 30 minutes, the Germans regained air superiority over the battlefield. Vasily's T-34 was caught in the open when the Stukas arrived. The distinctive howl of the Stuka's siren was terrifying even to veterans. "Dive bombers! Take cover!" he shouted, knowing there was nowhere to hide. The Stuka pulled out of its dive directly above them, releasing a 500-pound bomb. Vasily watched the bomb tumble toward them, seemingly in slow motion. Then Petro threw the T-34 into a hard turn, the tank's treads skidding across the torn earth. The bomb landed 15 yards away. The explosion picked up the 30-ton tank and threw it sideways. Inside, the crew was hurled against the steel walls. Vasily tasted blood in his mouth. His ears rang so loudly he couldn't hear anything else. "Everyone alive?" He managed to shout, though he couldn't hear his own voice. Slowly, his crew responded, bruised and bleeding, but alive. Miraculously, the tank was still operational, but the Stuka attack had devastated Soviet formations. Dozens of tanks were disabled or destroyed. The assault's momentum faltered. Then Soviet fighters arrived, Yak-9s and LA-5s, scrambling from nearby airfields. The sky above Prokhorovka erupted into a massive dogfight. Planes twisted and dove, trailing smoke and flame. The air battle was as intense as the ground battle below. Lieutenant Mikhail Baranov, flying a Yak-9, spotted a Stuka pulling out of its dive after destroying a Soviet tank column. He dove on the German bomber, his guns blazing. The Stuka tried to evade, but it was too slow and cumbersome. Baranov's cannon shells tore through its wing, and the Stuka spiraled into the ground. But a Messerschmitt had spotted Baranov and was on his tail. Tracers flashed past his cockpit. He threw the Yak into a violent series of turns, trying to shake his pursuer. His wingman, seeing his predicament, dove on the Messerschmitt and drove it off. The air battle raged for 2 hours. By the time the last German planes withdrew, both sides had suffered heavy losses. But the critical factor was that the Luftwaffe had been unable to decisively affect the ground battle. Soviet air defenses and fighters had prevented the wholesale slaughter that German air power might have inflicted. By mid-afternoon, the initial Soviet assault had stalled. The field was littered with hundreds of destroyed tanks, both Soviet and German. But the Germans were preparing a counterattack of their own. Standartenführer Joachim Peiper, commanding a battle group from the Leibstandarte division, assembled the remaining operational Tigers and Panthers for a counterstroke aimed at splitting the Soviet forces. "They've shot their bolt," Peiper told his commanders. "They've thrown everything at us and haven't broken through. Now it's our turn." Peiper's battle group consisted of approximately 40 tanks, including 12 Tigers. Against them, the Soviets could still field hundreds of tanks. But many were low on ammunition and fuel, and their crews were exhausted. At 4 p.m., the German counterattack crashed into the flank of the Soviet 18th Tank Corps. The Tigers, with their superior optics and guns, began methodically destroying Soviet tanks from medium range. The Panthers used their speed and firepower to penetrate deep into Soviet positions. For an hour, the German counterattack threatened to turn the tide of the entire battle. Soviet tank crews, already exhausted from 6 hours of combat, found themselves fighting for their lives against the German veterans. Colonel Mikhail Sinelnikov, commanding the 18th Tank Corps, watched in horror as his formations began to disintegrate under the German assault. "Commit the reserve," he ordered. "Everything we have left." His reserve consisted of 23 T-34s that had been held back for exactly this kind of emergency. They charged into the German flank, attacking with suicidal courage. The collision of the Soviet reserve with Piper's battle group created another intense close-quarters engagement. T-34s traded their lives to get killing shots on Tigers and Panthers. Infantry with anti-tank rifles fired at German vision ports and tracks, trying to disable the heavy tanks. By 5 p.m., Piper's counterattack had been stopped, but at terrible cost to the Soviets. The 18th Tank Corps had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength. As evening approached, both sides were reaching the point of complete exhaustion. Crews had been fighting for nearly 10 hours without rest. Tanks were running low on fuel and ammunition. The wounded lay everywhere, and there were too few medics to treat them all. Vasily's T-34 was nearly out of ammunition. They had 1 armor-piercing round and 3 high-explosive rounds left. The tank's transmission was making ominous grinding sounds. Petro reported that they were down to a quarter tank of fuel. "Lieutenant, we need to withdraw for resupply," Mikhail said. Vasily scanned the battlefield. The fighting had spread across a front of nearly 10 miles. Burning tanks dotted the landscape like monuments to the day's carnage. Bodies lay in heaps where infantry had been caught in the crossfire. "No new orders have come through," Vasily said. "We hold position until we hear otherwise." They pulled into a hull-down position behind a destroyed Panther, using the German tank's corpse as cover. Around them, the intensity of the fighting was finally beginning to decrease. Both sides were simply too exhausted to continue at the same pace. At 6 p.m., German forces made one final attempt to break through. A scratch force of 20 tanks, including some of the last operational Tigers, punched toward the Soviet rear areas, hoping to reach Rotmistrov's headquarters and create chaos. This breakthrough force, commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, son of the German foreign minister, exploited a gap in the Soviet lines and penetrated 3 miles behind the front. If they reached the Soviet command posts and supply dumps, they could unhinge the entire Soviet position. Standing between them and this objective were scattered Soviet units, many of them down to their last few tanks and shells. Among them was Vasily's T-34, enemy tanks approaching from the west. His radioman reported,
"Multiple contacts."
Vasily counted the German tanks through his periscope. 20 at least, including 5 Tigers. Against them, he could see perhaps 30 Soviet tanks in his immediate area, most of them damaged or low on ammunition. "This is Lieutenant Brukov to all nearby units," he broadcast on the company frequency. "Enemy breakthrough force approaching from the west. We must stop them here, for the motherland." The responses were weary but determined. Every Soviet tank that could still move and shoot turned to face this final threat. The engagement was brief but intense. The Germans, tired and low on ammunition themselves, fought with professional skill but diminishing strength. The Soviets fought with desperate determination, knowing that if this breakthrough succeeded, the entire day's sacrifice would be for nothing. Vasily's tank fired their last armor-piercing round at a Panzer IV, scoring a hit that set it aflame. With only high-explosive rounds left, they engaged German infantry supporting the tanks. A Tiger came into view, its gun traversing toward them. Vasily knew a high-explosive round wouldn't penetrate its armor. "Driver, ram it," he ordered. "Are you insane?" Petro shouted back, "Do it! It's our only chance!" The T-34 surged forward. The Tiger fired, but in its haste the shot went high, missing the charging Soviet tank. Before the Tiger could reload, the T-34 slammed into its side at full speed. The collision was catastrophic. The T-34's thin armor crumpled against the Tiger's heavy armor. Inside the Soviet tank, Vasily and his crew were thrown about like rag dolls. The impact jammed the Tiger's turret ring and damaged its tracks, immobilizing it. "Bail out! Bail out!" Vasily screamed. The crew scrambled out of their wrecked tank. The Tiger's crew was also evacuating their immobilized vehicle. For a surreal moment, both crews found themselves staggering around in the same small area, too exhausted and stunned to fight. Then Soviet infantry arrived, and the German crews surrendered. The German breakthrough had been stopped. Von Ribbentrop's force was destroyed or forced to retreat. The crisis had passed. As darkness fell on July 12, 1943, the Battle of Prokhorovka finally wound down. Both sides were too exhausted to continue. The field fell silent except for the moans of the wounded and the crackle of burning vehicles. The scene was apocalyptic. Over an area of less than 10 square miles, hundreds of tanks lay destroyed or damaged. The beautiful wheat fields had been transformed into a moonscape of craters, burning metal, and death. The smell of burning flesh, diesel fuel, and cordite hung heavy in the air. Soviet medics moved across the battlefield, trying to find and treat the wounded. Many could not be saved. Vasily, his crew having survived when their tank did not, helped pull wounded men from burning vehicles. It was gruesome work, and some of the things he saw that night would haunt him for the rest of his life. The casualty counts were staggering. The 5th Guards Tank Army had lost over 400 tanks, more than half its strength. The 18th and 29th Tank Corps were virtually destroyed. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were dead or wounded. The Germans had also suffered terribly. While their losses in tanks were lower, perhaps 8,100 tanks completely destroyed, many more were damaged and would require extensive repairs. More critically, their offensive power had been shattered. Operation Citadel had failed. In his headquarters, Lieutenant General Rotmistrov surveyed the casualty reports with a heavy heart. The losses were far worse than anticipated. Some of his staff officers were openly weeping. "Comrade General, we've lost over half our armor," his chief of staff reported. "The corps are combat ineffective." Rotmistrov nodded slowly. "But have we stopped the Germans?" "Yes, Comrade General. The German offensive has been halted. They're pulling back to defensive positions." A grim smile crossed Rotmistrov's face. "Then we have succeeded. The price was terrible, but we have succeeded." On the German side, von Manstein and his commanders faced the bitter reality that Operation Citadel had failed. The breakthrough they needed had not materialized. The Soviet defenses, while battered, had not broken, and the losses in irreplaceable tanks and veteran crews were unsustainable. "We cannot continue the offensive," von Manstein admitted to his staff. "We must transition to the defensive." It was a watershed moment in the war. Never again would Germany launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht would be in retreat, fighting desperate defensive battles as the Red Army ground its way toward Berlin. While Prokhorovka has captured the historical imagination, equally desperate battles were fought at locations across the Kursk salient that have been largely forgotten by history. At the village of Vasilyevka, 5 miles east of Prokhorovka, a small force of Soviet anti-tank gunners had been dug in since July 10th. Their position blocked a secondary route that German forces might use to outflank the main Soviet positions. The unit consisted of just 12 76mm anti-tank guns, commanded by Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrinenko. His men were a mix of veterans and raw recruits, hastily thrown together as the German offensive developed. On July 12th, while the massive tank battle raged at Prokhorovka, a German Kampfgruppe battle group, consisting of 30 tanks and a battalion of motorized infantry, attempted to use the Vasilyevka route to penetrate Soviet rear areas. Lavrinenko's guns were all that stood in their way. "Hold your fire until they're within 400 meters. Lavrinenko ordered his gun crews. "We only get one chance at this." The German column approached with confidence, unaware of the ambush waiting for them. They expected light resistance at most on this secondary route. When the lead tanks reached 400 meters, Lavrinenko gave the order. "Fire." All 12 guns fired simultaneously. The first volley destroyed or disabled 6 German tanks. The column ground to a confused halt as subsequent volleys crashed into them, but the German infantry quickly deployed and began to assault the Soviet positions. The anti-tank gunners found themselves fighting desperately to defend their guns against German infantry armed with machine guns. grenades and flamethrowers. Gun after gun fell silent as their crews were killed or wounded. Lavrinenko himself took command of a gun whose entire crew had been killed, loading and firing it single-handedly even as German soldiers closed to within grenade range. By the time Soviet reinforcements arrived 2 hours later, only 3 of the 12 guns remained operational. Lavrinenko was badly wounded, and 40 of his 60 men were dead or wounded, but they had stopped the German breakthrough. 20 German tanks lay destroyed around their position, and the German infantry battalion had been mauled. The Vasilievka route remained blocked. This small forgotten action had strategic consequences. By preventing the German flanking maneuver, Lavrinenko's tiny force had helped ensure that Rotmistrov's forces at Prokhorovka could not be surrounded and destroyed. North of Prokhorovka, along the Sel River, another critical battle was unfolding that would receive little attention in the history books. The 95th Guards Rifle Division had established a bridgehead on the southern bank of the Pesel, directly in the path of the advancing 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. If the Germans could eliminate this bridgehead, they could cross the river and attack Prokhorovka from the north, enveloping the Soviet forces. Colonel Ivan Nekrasov commanded the division, which had already been reduced to about half strength from previous fighting. His men were dug into hastily prepared positions along the riverbank, supported by a handful of anti-tank guns and mortars. On the morning of July 12th, as the main battle at Prokhorovka erupted, the Totenkopf division launched a massive assault on the bridgehead. Tanks and infantry, supported by artillery and Stuka dive bombers, crashed into the Soviet positions. "They mean to destroy us completely," Nekrasov told his staff. "We will not yield 1 meter of ground." The fighting was particularly brutal because the confined space of the bridgehead prevented maneuver. It became a straightforward test of will, German firepower against Soviet determination. German tanks pushed into the Soviet positions, crushing trenches and bunkers under their treads. Soviet soldiers attacked the tanks with Molotov cocktails, anti-tank grenades, and even magnetic mines attached by hand. It was the most primitive form of anti-tank warfare, and the casualty rate was horrific. Private Alexei Gorshkov, an 18-year-old rifleman who had been at the front for less than a month, found himself face-to-face with a Panzer IV that had broken into his section's trench line. Armed only with a rifle and 2 grenades, he climbed onto the back of the tank and dropped both grenades into the open engine compartment before being shot by German infantry. The tank exploded, but Gorshkov did not survive to see it. Such acts of desperate courage were repeated hundreds of times across the bridgehead that day. The 95th Guards Rifle Division was being ground to pieces, but they held their ground. By evening, the German assault had been repulsed, but at catastrophic cost. Of the 7,000 men who had started the day in the 95th Guards Rifle Division, fewer than 2,000 were still fit for duty. The division had ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit, but the bridgehead held. The Germans could not cross the Sel River, and the northern flank of the Prokhorovka battlefield remained secure. Years later, when historians studied the Battle of Prokhorovka, most would focus on the tank clash and overlook the sacrificial stand of the 95th Guards Rifle Division. Yet without their sacrifice, the outcome of the larger battle might have been very different. Southwest of the main engagement, Hill 226.6 had been fortified by German forces and converted into a strongpoint, bristling with anti-tank guns, mortars, and machine gun nests. From this position, German observers could direct artillery fire onto Soviet supply routes. The task of taking this hill fell to the 42nd Guards Rifle Division, commanded by Colonel Pyotr Govorunenko. Intelligence indicated that the hill was defended by at least a battalion of German infantry, supported by several tanks and numerous artillery pieces. Govorunenko planned a night assault for the evening of July 12th, after the main tank battle had subsided. His men would attack under cover of darkness to negate German firepower advantages. At 11 p.m., after a brief but intense artillery barrage, 3 regiments of Soviet infantry advanced up the hill through the darkness. The Germans, alerted by the artillery fire, were waiting. German machine guns opened fire, tracers cutting through the night like deadly fireflies. Soviet soldiers fell in rows, but the assault continued. Survivors reached the German trenches, and a vicious close-quarters battle erupted. Lieutenant Nikolai Ozerov led his company in a bayonet charge against a German machine gun position. In the darkness, the fighting devolved into a medieval brawl. Rifle butts, bayonets, entrenching tools, and bare hands. Ozerov killed 3 German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat before being severely wounded by a grenade. The battle raged for 4 hours. Positions changed hands multiple times. German counterattacks pushed the Soviets back down the hill, only to be driven back by fresh Soviet assaults. By 3 a.m. on July 13th, the hill was in Soviet hands. The cost had been terrible, over 200 casualties to capture a position that most people would never hear about. But German artillery observers had been eliminated, and Soviet supply lines were now more secure. Vasily Bryukov sat on the hull of a destroyed Panzer IV, watching the sun rise over the battlefield. He was alive, which surprised him. His crew was alive, which seemed like a miracle. Their tank was destroyed, but tanks could be replaced. Men could not. Around him, the grim work of battlefield cleanup was underway. Recovery crews were dragging disabled tanks back to repair facilities. Burial details were collecting bodies, a task made more difficult because in many cases, Soviet and German dead lay intermingled and sometimes burned beyond recognition. The field medics were still working, though most of the wounded who could be saved had already been evacuated. Those still on the battlefield were either too badly wounded to move or beyond help. Lieutenant, a runner from division headquarters, jogged up to him. "You're to report to the personnel section. They're reforming the tank companies." Vasily nodded wearily and stood up. The war would continue, with or without him. There would be new tanks, new crews, new battles. The road to Berlin was long, and it would be paved with more days like July 12th. In headquarters across the battlefield, commanders on both sides were tallying the butcher's bill from Prokhorovka and the surrounding engagements. Soviet losses were staggering. The 5th Guards Tank Army had lost approximately 500 tanks destroyed or heavily damaged. Thousands of soldiers were dead or wounded. Some tank brigades had been virtually annihilated, but the Germans had also suffered heavily. While their tank losses were lower in absolute numbers, perhaps 8,100 tanks destroyed and another 200 damaged, these losses were irreplaceable. Germany's tank production could not keep pace with losses. Each Tiger tank destroyed was a strategic loss that could not be quickly remedied. More importantly, the German offensive had been decisively halted. Operation Citadel had failed to achieve its objectives. The Kursk salient had not been eliminated. The Soviet armies within it had not been destroyed. For the first time in the war, a major German summer offensive had been stopped cold by Soviet defenses and counterattacks. Beyond the statistics and strategic analysis, Prokhorovka was a human tragedy of immense proportions. Behind every destroyed tank was a crew, 4 or 5 men who had lived, loved, feared, and hoped. Most of them died in their steel coffins, burned alive or crushed when their ammunition exploded. Anna Yegorova was a nurse with the 29th Tank Corps. For 2 days and nights after the battle, she worked without rest, treating wounded men who kept arriving in endless streams. The burns were the worst, she would later recall. Tank crews who had escaped their burning vehicles but were horribly burned. "We had so little morphine, so little of everything. All we could do was try to make them comfortable and hope they died quickly." She treated Soviet soldiers and German prisoners alike. "They were all just boys," she said. 18, 19, 20 years old. They cried for their mothers in Russian and German. Pain sounds the same in every language. On the German side, Michael Wittmann, who had bailed out of his destroyed Tiger, found himself taking stock of his company's losses. Of the 14 Tigers his company had started the battle with, only 6 were still operational. The others were destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. "We won every tactical engagement," Wittmann said to a fellow officer. "We killed more of them than they killed of us. But there are so many of them, and they keep coming. I don't see how we can win this war." It was a sentiment increasingly common among German veterans on the Eastern Front. They could win battles, but they were losing the war. The failure at Prokhorovka was the death blow for Operation Citadel, but it was not the only factor in the operation's failure. In the northern sector of the Kursk salient, Army Group Center's offensive had also stalled. The Soviet defenses there had proven equally resilient. German forces had penetrated only about 12 miles into Soviet lines before being halted. On July 13th, Hitler summoned his senior commanders to his headquarters in East Prussia. The meeting was tense. "The Western Allies have landed in Sicily," Hitler informed them, "Italy is collapsing. We must transfer divisions to the Mediterranean theater. Operation Citadel is cancelled." Von Manstein protested, "Give me another week and I can achieve a breakthrough." But Hitler was adamant. The strategic situation had changed. Germany could no longer concentrate all its power in the east. The multi-front war that German military planners had always feared was now reality. On July 17th, Hitler issued orders for German forces to transition to the defensive. The last German offensive on the Eastern Front was over. The Red Army did not wait for the Germans to recover. On July 12th, even as the Battle of Prokhorovka was still raging, Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov against the German positions in the northern sector of the Kursk salient. On August 3rd, the Soviets launched Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev, named after a Russian general from the 18th century, in the south. These counteroffensives would drive the Germans back hundreds of miles over the following months. Vasily Bryukov, assigned to a new T-34 with a new crew, participated in these offensives. They liberated Kharkov in late August. They crossed the Dnieper River in the fall. They pushed westward, mile by bloody mile, toward Poland and eventually Germany itself. The lessons learned at Prokhorovka, the importance of closing with the enemy quickly, the value of combined arms tactics, the necessity of accepting terrible casualties to achieve victory, would be applied again and again in the battles to come. Historians often debate whether Stalingrad or Kursk was the true turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. The truth is that both battles were critical. Stalingrad demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could be defeated. Kursk demonstrated that the Red Army could stop a major German offensive and then counterattack successfully. After Kursk, the strategic initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Germany would fight skillfully and desperately for another 2 years, but it would always be reacting to Soviet moves, never again dictating the course of operations. The road from Kursk to Berlin would be long and bloody. Over 20 million Soviet citizens would die before the war ended. But on July 12, 1943, in the wheat fields around Prokhorovka, the outcome of that war was decided. Vasily Bryukov survived the war. He fought through Ukraine, Poland, and finally Germany itself. He was wounded twice more but recovered each time. He ended the war as a captain, commanding a tank company that helped capture Berlin in May 1945. After the war, he returned to his home village in the Urals. He married, had children, and lived quietly. He rarely spoke about the war and never about Prokhorovka. When asked about it, he would simply say, "We did what was necessary." He died in 1987, an old man who had lived to see his grandchildren. At his funeral, his surviving crew members, Mikhail and Petro, who had also survived the war, stood by his grave and toasted his memory with vodka. "He saved our lives at Prokhorovka," Mikhail said. "Ramming that tiger was insane, but it worked. He was a good commander and a good man." Michael Wittmann survived Prokhorovka and continued fighting. He became one of the most successful tank commanders in history, credited with destroying 138 enemy tanks. He was killed in Normandy in August 1944 when his Tiger was destroyed by British forces. Many of the young men who fought at Prokhorovka did not survive the war. Those who did were forever marked by what they had experienced on that terrible day. Today, the fields around Prokhorovka are peaceful again. Wheat grows where tanks once burned. The small town has returned to its quiet rural life, but the evidence of the battle remains. Farmers still occasionally uncover the rusted hulks of tanks buried in their fields. Unexploded ordnance is found regularly enough that specialized teams are kept on call to deal with it. A massive memorial stands on a hill overlooking the battlefield, a giant steel sculpture depicting a Soviet tank breaking through enemy lines. Every year on July 12th, veterans, fewer each year as time takes its toll, gather there to remember their fallen comrades. Near the memorial is a small museum displaying artifacts from the battle. Rusted tank parts, helmets, weapons, personal effects, photographs line the walls. Young men in uniform, most of them dead before their 25th birthdays. The Battle of Prokhorovka has become legendary, though as with all legends, the reality is more complex than the myth. Soviet propaganda inflated the victory, claiming absurdly high German losses and minimizing Soviet casualties. German sources sometimes did the opposite. The truth is that Prokhorovka was a brutal, costly battle that neither side won in a conventional sense. Soviet losses were higher than German losses, but strategically the Soviets achieved their objective. The German offensive was halted, and the initiative passed to the Red Army. The lesser-known localized fights around Prokhorovka, at Vasilievka, the Pisel River, Hill 226.6, and dozens of other locations were just as important as the main tank battle. They demonstrated that war is not decided by single climactic battles, but by the cumulative effect of hundreds of desperate engagements. Many of them fought in obscurity by ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things. The Battle of Prokhorovka offers sobering lessons about the nature of modern warfare. The scale of destruction, hundreds of tanks destroyed in a single day, thousands of men killed in a few hours, demonstrated that industrialized warfare had reached a level of lethality unprecedented in human history. The personal courage displayed by soldiers on both sides was remarkable. Men charged into certain death because duty and loyalty demanded it. They remained at their posts under impossible circumstances. They saved their comrades at the cost of their own lives, but courage alone could not change the fundamental calculus of the war. Germany, fighting a multi-front war against enemies with vastly superior resources, could not win through tactical excellence alone. The Soviet Union, despite horrendous casualties, had the population, industrial base, and strategic depth to absorb losses that would have destroyed other nations. Prokhorovka was a microcosm of the entire Eastern Front, a meat grinder where men and machines were consumed in vast numbers in pursuit of strategic objectives. It was warfare stripped of romance and glory, revealing only horror and sacrifice. In 1987, an American journalist interviewed a group of Soviet veterans who had fought at Prokhorovka. One old man, when asked what he remembered most about the battle, thought for a long moment before responding. "I remember the silence," he said. After the fighting stopped, there was this terrible silence. No engines, no guns, no shouting, just the crackling of fires and the moaning of the wounded. I had never heard such complete silence before, and I never have since. It was the silence of death. He paused, staring into the distance at something only he could see. "We called ourselves victors because we survived, but nobody really wins a battle like Prokhorovka. You just survive it or you don't, and those of us who survived, we left part of ourselves there in those wheat fields. The best part, maybe. The wheat still grows at Prokhorovka, green in spring, golden in summer. The land is healed as land always does, but it remembers. In every handful of soil there is iron and blood, steel and bone, the residue of the day when history pivoted, when thousands of men fought and died in the largest tank battle the world has ever seen. And in the quiet moments when the wind blows across those fields, you can almost hear the echoes of engines roaring, guns firing, and men crying out in a dozen different languages, all of them speaking the universal language of war.